Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on accelerating development and uptake of optimal formulations for kids. This is with great pleasure that I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Global Accelerator for Pediatric Formulations partners. We're going to hear about a lot of progress in the field, a lot of technical progress, but also a lot of political commitments. And this is my pleasure to introduce to you, for opening remarks, three leaders, remarkable people in the field of pediatric HIV, who will frame the situation and the progress happening at the moment. And this is going to be with Chip Lyons from ECPAF, Linda Gayle Becker from the Desmond Tutu HIV Center, also I as president, and Ambassador Deborah Burks from PEPFAR.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being in 11B at 10:15, starting very promptly. It's a pleasure to join my colleagues on the panel. We're going to be very brief so we can listen to a number of folks who really know where we are. Yes, we've made progress, but I think we can all agree not at the pace, not with the scope, and not with the durability that we're after. I just want to review both the sort of premise and the objective of GAP-F. Kids wait for the best formulations, unconscionably long in many cases, too long in every case. Not only do they wait, they're using suboptimal formulations that can be less effective, more difficult for the child to take, for the caregiver to administer. That can lead to dropout temporarily or permanently. It can lead to resistance. It almost certainly will lead to increased mortality and morbidity. So we don't, what we have to get at is what are the obstacles to having pediatric formulations at the same pace as adult formulations. HIV is probably the best place to really use that as the entry point for accelerated optimizing of formulations. I think it's only 2 years ago there was a pediatric TB medication after decades of the availability of adult medicine. That's the gap. That's the GAP-F. That's the gap that we're trying to fill. And you will hear from those working very hard on this that there are steps in the right direction, some very encouraging work and announcement and some guidance given by the American Food and Drug Administration. And with I want to thank Ambassador Burks both for a meeting that she helped convene last fall and for the follow-up to that created the opportunity and the information for the FDA to take that step. The GAP-F really seeks to bring together some of the key partners that are necessary to advance in this area. I think there's been a number of conversations in various cities, including in Durban 2 years ago. The table's been set, if you will. A lot of people invited, a lot of people attending, serious in wanting to make progress. I think the issue now is really what progress, what target, what timetable are we going to move towards so that the theory, which is compelling and important, this is really important area of work. I think the challenge to all of us is let's get on with it through focus, identifying target and time frame. So what comes out the other end of the pipe is optimized formulation for kids. We have so many sessions here on case finding, new FIA studies that identify exposed children over 5 that are going to be difficult to find. When we do, we need optimized formulations for the best possible health outcomes for those kids. So that's what we're after throughout the session, and Linda Gayle will have some welcome remarks and comments, followed by Ambassador Burks, and then there are several panelists. Thanks again for being here.
Thanks so much, Chip, and brilliantly said. My name is Linda Gayle Becker. Thanks for being here. And my task is really just to reassure you all that the International AIDS Society is absolutely behind this very, very important commitment. And really looking at this agenda put together today, the work that's being done, everyone present in this room, it truly is a story about a village to put together a complex project like this, and many, many different kinds of talents and groups and institutions to make it happen. So we want to thank you again for all of your commitment. At the IS, we endorse and fully support this work. We're proud to have been part of it. And we've brought many of you together for roundtable discussions organized by Sebastian and the ILF, as well, of course, Marissa and the CIPHER initiative at the IS. It's fed into that work. We continue, we hope, to be useful core members of the GAPF team through ILF CIPHER. And if there are other ways that the International AIDS Society can contribute to this work that we have not thought of, we really want to hear about that, because it is important, clearly, that we are doing everything we can. Through CIPHER, and I want to pay some tribute to partnerships. We've collaborated particularly with the World Health Organization, Martina and your team, in developing the global research agendas in pediatric and adolescent HIV for AIDS and AIDS-free generation. We've just launched that special issue in JADES, and it highlights key considerations that are in part being addressed through the work that is being done here today, such as optimizing clinical trial design. So I really encourage you to look at that issue if you've not yet been able to do it. We are working also to support observational cohort collaboration to help inform this agenda, and of course to support enhanced monitoring and pharmacovigilance of new and existing drugs in children. So again, I think highlighting some of the gaps and again pointing where we need to go. I fully agree with you, Chip. It's about now really accelerating the accelerated plan and putting some granularity into that detail. It is, of course, essential that we continue to work together to solve the many technical, structural, financial barriers that have kept children from having access to optimal formulations for so long. But we, I think, are making progress. Pay tribute again to all the hard work, and I'm very pleased that this meeting again is happening at AIDS 2018. Thanks for all being here, for your continued dedication, and Godspeed as we move to really see the end of this project. And now I'll hand over to Ambassador.
Thank you, and thank you, Linda, Gayle, for prioritizing this with your amazing schedule that you have over the next 5 days and bringing us together. Just very quick, and I think I hit a button and I apologize. Let me make clear that we understand as program managers what our role has been in creating the difficulties for infants and children. We know now from the FIAs, the comprehensive impact surveys that have been in the field, and now from the ones that were announced yesterday and the one that will be announced on Wednesday from the NIBIA, that the gap that exists in the diagnosis of 0 to 14-year-olds is extraordinary. And less than 50% of the children have been diagnosed. And I think this is really a critical issue for all of us, and it's really important that we're supporting families to the point and communities that people are comfortable in bringing their children forward and receiving that diagnosis and undergoing treatment. An adult can hide their treatment. It's much more difficult to hide a children's treatment, and I think that the level of stigma and discrimination that must still be highly persistent in communities is leading to this difficult problem. We have a large agenda ahead of us in order to meet the needs of diagnosis of those children, but as Chip really made it clear, having the best therapeutic products for those children is also incredibly important to us. So I just wanted to be very clear that we're committed to doing what we need to do to ensure that children are diagnosed. I think what we need is to ensure that there are formulations that they can utilize. I'm particularly sensitive to this issue at this moment. I'm a grandmother of a 7-month-old who needs medication 3 times a day since the 1 month. no one wants to give her that anymore. I don't know what they're doing while I'm gone. I'm a little bit worried about it because she's so upset that someone would traumatize her with such horrible tasting medicine that she looks at the care provider like we're killing her. And now she's learned to hold it in her mouth, and immediately when we turn around, she spits it out. So we understand now, I personally do understand, how important it is to find formulations that caregivers can give, because it's very difficult and much more difficult than I ever perceived. So as we work forward together, that's critically important to us. One last comment. For those of you who are here from host countries in which we work, in which the Global Fund works, please evaluate your drug regimens immediately for children and adolescents, and make sure that we're no longer using inferior regimens for children and adolescents. We can change that today. And we know what you're ordering because we can see. So please stop using nevirapine-based products unless absolutely necessary. That should be a rare event, and it should not be 25% of your children, adolescents, and young adults. This is why they are not virally suppressed. So let's, as the program people, do what we need to do on our end, while companies and others are doing what they need on their end. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to Chair Linda Gayle and Ambassador Burks. This is a pleasure to have you here, and we've heard about progress but also gaps, and it's important to keep moving forward. So now I'm going to call on the speakers of the next series of presentations. Please come up to the stage. All the people will speak until the Q&A period. So you will see from the agenda that we have 4 presentations coming now. And there will be a Q&A period for all of them at once. So please keep your questions, write them down. We're going to have time for that. So before I move forward, thanks to Ambassador Burks for changing the slide for me. I forgot to show my disclosure, so I invite everyone to make sure they show their disclosure. And if they don't have slides, just mention it. It's important to keep time. It's a very busy schedule. So before we go into the technical areas of this work, I'd like to welcome Sharifa from Stigmaless, Uganda, who will tell us the story about what really do suboptimal formulations mean to someone's life. So Sharifa, up to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so excited to see you all here. I'm really glad. My name is Nalgo Sharifa, as he has introduced, and I work with Stigmaless Uganda, an organization that helps young people who have failed first and second line psychologically. I'm happy to tell you that I was and I am the Miss Young People Living with HIV in Uganda, 2014 to 15. And this is a project that is peer-led by Uganda Network of Young People Living with HIV to fight stigma and discrimination, but using beauty. I'm here today to share about the challenges that children face while taking these medications, and I'll use my personal experience because I'm here. I started my medication, I was 6 years of age, and currently I am 23 years of age. But the biggest challenges that I really faced was the pill burden. As a young person, it was really difficult for me to take these drugs. And the size of the drugs, it was really, really not easy for me as a young person. Not talking about the size of the drugs, I could swallow them. Sometimes they could stuck in my throat. And I could take a lot of water, a lot of bananas to make sure I solve this problem. But unfortunately, nothing happened. Sometimes they could not go. They could not move out of my throat. It reached a time when I even ate bananas. And like every time I order a banana, I'm like, this is, I have to take my medication. The smell comes up, the worry and all that. It all came out when, just holding a banana. And not to talk about the smell. that test, my God, it was really horrible. Another challenge that I faced was the side effects. I could take this medication and I vomit. And sometimes I could just develop the nausea. And my mom would be so disappointed with me. I remember there was a time when I took these drugs and I vomited them out. So she was so disappointed and told me, pick it up and put it back in your mouth. You don't know how it tastes. You don't want to imagine how it feels. When the creamy part is off, my God, you do not want to join me this side. Sometimes I wished if these drugs were like chocolate, because we ate chocolates, and those sweetie things are so lucky because of the scent you get when you eat the vanilla one, when you eat the strawberry one, that smell that you really get, it's really nice. But with the medications, it is not like that. It is something different. The smell is horrible. It was horrible back then. Another challenge was the drug stockouts. I live in a place in Kampala called Motunrechininyavigo, and I get my medications from Joint Clinical Research Center. Back then it was located at Mengo when I was 6 years of age. And my mom is a single mother. My father died when I was 1 year old. And my mom could struggle looking for money just to take me to the health center. And when we reach the health center, they tell you the drugs are limited. You have to get a 2 weeks drug. And just for your friends to also get these drugs, I'm sorry. Just for your friends to also get these drugs. So you have to get a 2 weeks refill. And you have to go back after 2 weeks to get another refill. And I could see my mom struggling so hard to look for that money to take me back to the health center after the 2 weeks. And sometimes I could miss my appointment just because the money is not there and all that. But I'm glad now it's kind of okay. As I told you in the first beginning, I work with Stigmaless Uganda. We help children who have failed first and second line. We help them psychologically to translate to the third line medication. And back then, I have this young kid I am interacting with. He's 9 years of age, and he tells me he has failed his first and second line. So the doctor referred him to me so that we could talk and maybe find out what's the problem, why is he on the third line. So when I talked to this young kid, he told me I could not tolerate the smell. I could not tolerate the side effects. It could bring him a skin rash. So I was like, I could not tolerate the skin rash. My friends will laugh at me if I take this medication. So I had to lie to the grandmother that I'm taking these pills just for her to be okay and feel fine, because mothers and grandmothers, you know how it feels. But he used to tell me that I'm just throwing them away. I pretend I'm drinking water, but then I just throw it away in my bag. And then I asked him, what do we think that we need to do so that you can take this medication? And he told me in a calm voice, I wish you could talk to the doctors so that they make this drug a favorable one. Like in a day, I just take a measured milligram of a sweet syrup that I could even remember, even if I'm playing with my friends, I could just remember that I have to take these medications because it is sweet. So in his terms, he told me, maybe if they can make them as vitamins. In Uganda, they have vitamins, they are orange in color, and if you want a kid to take the medication, you bring out the vitamin, you're like, I'm going to give you this if you take this medication. So it was like, I wish they are like vitamins. I wish they won't make me develop these side effects. Ladies and gentlemen, we all wish you could look into this and make an optimal drug for the children.
Thanks a lot, Sharifa. So now we'll move from this personal testimony to a series of technical presentations looking at acceleration of development and uptake of pediatric formulation. So acceleration part 1 will be by Ellen Abrams and Carlo Giacinto from Impact and Pinta ID.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm very, very pleased, of course, to be here. I am a pediatrician from the University of Padova, and I am the coordinator of the Penta Network. I'm very, very glad and honored to share this presentation with Elaine from Colombia and Impact. So we are going to talk about the first part of the acceleration process. So we know that the accelerating the development and the uptake of pediatric drug and pediatric formulation is something extremely challenging. There are different parts. There are a mechanicistical approach which needs to flow very smoothly in order at the end of the day to be able to achieve our goal. So the Global Accelerator is really a program we have been working to set it up in a very detailed way how it should work. We have actually 3 parts which represent the 3 presentations that we are going to have now. The first one, which is the one that I'm going to do now together with Elaine, is really to talk about the PIRG priorities, the prioritization work, and the research development, and especially the role of the research network. Then there will be other 2 parts. One will be the development, including the regulatory approvals, and the third one will be the implementation and the procurement and the introduction into the field. So we all know that developing ARV for children as well as developing drug for pediatrics in all other fields is very, very complicated. In the case of HIV, the natural history is different between adults and children. We have a higher mortality and viral load in younger children. We know that without antiretroviral therapy, for those of you who were around in the 80s to look for children with HIV infection, we had a very, very high mortality in the first 6 months of age with no drugs available. The growth and the puberty are physiological condition, which might affect the drug metabolism in different way, directly or indirectly. The drug metabolism, as I said, are very different because the metabolic pathways change over time. Already in the first weeks and months of life, there might be major changes in the metabolism of drugs. We might have a specific issue, and the Ambassador Birx pointed it out very clearly, that we might have infants and children infected with resistance nevirapine, with virus resistant to nevirapines. We might have key and specific comorbidities like hepatitis, malaria, malnutrition, which is something I would say specific for pediatrics, anemia, which might affect the use and also the safety and the efficacy of the drug that we are going to use. And then last but not least, children are sometimes it's not so simple to give drugs which are not palatable or not suitable for children. So that is the reason why the access to pediatric drugs, is objectively takes a long time, a too long time. These are the data for antiretrovirals, but we could do tens of these slides in different other disease areas. We see that the main antiretrovirals for adults were developed between 5 to 8 to 10 years before their implementation and development in the pediatric population. The role of the Global Accelerator, and specifically of the PAedo group and the research network, will not be to develop all drugs that we have for adults, but we really need to prioritize the drug that we need based on the characteristic of the children. Those with the higher potential in terms of public health impact. And that is where the PAedo, which is the Pediatric ARV Drug Optimization Group, has really been working in the last 5 years. It was set up in 2013 and has been working throughout from 2013 till now. And you can see from these slides how the priorities recommended by PAedo change over time. They change based on new knowledge input that we have from adults, that we have from other disease, that we have from observational and clinical trials in children as well, and also by new knowledge on new drugs. So I think that really the key word to explain how the PAedo works is really dynamics. You can see over time how we were able to change the way which the priority was set up. Dynamic pragmatism, because we need to be pragmatic, and also flexibility, because we do not just need to tell what can be a theoretical priority, but we also need to be practical. As part of the PAedo was not just which drug we should look for, but also more specifically, PAedo is recommending some implementation pathways. Just to give you an example, on dolutegravir single, PAedo recommended to develop 10 milligrams co-dispersible tablets for the youngest, but also 50 milligrams core tablets, which could really develop, accelerate the development of generic for children older weighing more than 15 or 20 kilo. The same is for raltegravir, that we know it is an effective integrase in neonates, and also really to develop very small strength co-dispersible tablets to be used in neonates and in infants. So that clearly reflects the fact on how PAedo prioritization must be, and it is directly embedded with the guidelines development, because the guidelines, of course, are developed based on the evidence base that we can get from research, but the research is driven also by the priority and also by what it is feasible. And the work of PAedo and of the guidelines development group, which is very much interrelated, would not be successful if we should not have a very strong collaboration with industries, and which then, of course, is the key part, is the key for a successful implementation. So the prioritization of research is not just the PAedo, it's also the PAWG, and I'm going to leave the word to my distinguished friend.
Okay, so I'll take you into the second wheel, which is the research wheel, and the PIWG is the Pediatric Antiretroviral Working Group. And this is a group of basically the world experts on pediatric antiretroviral pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, pharmacology, and a bunch of dedicated nerds who spend their time thinking about the best way to dose infant children and adolescents. And they play an enabling role to help accelerate this whole process, define standards for research to enable accelerated pediatric ARV development, advise WHO on clinical and pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic issues related to pediatric ARV use, and offer scientific advice to stakeholders involved in the development of pediatric antiretrovirals. Let's see. Nope. Okay. So as you can see depicted here, the PIWG plays a critical role in working with industry and the SRAs to close the loop on pediatric development plans. They provide technical opinion on PIPs and PSPs to regulators and promote alignment and focus between agencies. And industry seeks technical advice from the PAWG to inform submission and implementation of PIPs and PSPs that address the real need. And this process facilitates PIP development and customizes it to the populations and the needs of children specifically. Again, to further the development and accelerate these plans. And PAWG has also spent a fair amount of time trying to optimize trial design so pediatric plans can take place much faster and that the trial period is much shorter. And here this just depicts in dark blue the original set of sequential processes that often took 5 to 9 years from development of formulations in adults to get the drugs approved in children. And they've now proposed a much shorter, faster process to move drugs from adult to children, to test them, to get the right dose and the right formulations. The PAWG has also put forward a set of key principles to accelerate research to inform development. And this starts with getting studies right from the very beginning, enabling more rapid enrollment in studies. Historically, we had sequential stepping down in age where we studied new drugs in the oldest children, and then as we demonstrated dosing and safety, we'd sort of march down to younger ages. Really propose now that that's no longer necessary, and that as the formulation becomes available, it can be studied across all ages, but more importantly, to be studied by weight rather than age to make the drugs easily implementable in low-resource settings. That adults should be included in adolescent registrational trials, that we need to maximize the use of pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic studies and PK modeling using efficacy results from adults and rapidly moving the drugs into pediatric populations. Propose to use innovative trial designs and, very importantly, collaboration between investigators and networks across the world, the folks who work on these kinds of issues as their bread and butter. So just to give you an example, this is the sequential approach that we have been doing for many years, going from a registrational trial to a strategic trial to introduction into guidelines. And now under these new paradigm, and this would generally take quite a long time. And under the new paradigm, using dolutegravir as an example, we've been able to accelerate the process. Here you see 1093 is the registrational trial for dolutegravir in children being done by the Impact Network. The Odyssey trial is more of an efficacy trial, which has embedded some PK studies, and these two studies have been working together closely to inform each other and are overlapping in timeline, which have been informing the guidelines process quite directly. And this will allow the use of dolutegravir in children 3 years earlier than it would have had we gone this old approach, and potentially will lead to close to 500,000 children, more children able to access this regimen. So looking forward, prioritization and clinical research remain the first critical steps in making better drugs available for children. Solutions to focus and accelerate research undertaken are being tested and appear really quite promising. And I think the experiences over the last couple of years have allowed us to accelerate several drugs, not just dolutegravir. Open and transparent communication with industry and regulators is of critical importance, and also accessing this expertise from the very beginning. PAedo 3 prioritization prompted discussion on TB and hepatitis, and PAedo-like approaches for both of these diseases are being planned. And when moving beyond HIV, priorities will need to be identified clearly in collaboration with other global initiatives. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen and Carlo. So we will now shift gears and look at development and regulatory approval with our partners from CHI, Melinda Watkins, and Fernando Pascual from the Medicines Patent Pool.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for coming to this session. Melinda and myself, we will be talking about activities and actions that have been undertaken in the past years. Some of those were already mentioned, so I will go through quickly to accelerate development and uptake of the most needed formulations, because this has served as a basis and have provided very valuable lessons learned for the Global Accelerator for Pediatric Formulations. So we have nothing to disclose. This slide that serves as background wants to show that despite all the efforts made over the last years by companies providing pediatric formulations and pediatric clinical trials, and by genetics by making more adapted pediatric formulations, we still see a lot of suboptimal formulations, and I explain. The middle column shows in green those formulations that are considered optimal by a group of experts, that they developed the optimal formulary list, although there is one to be released, but this is 2016. And we see in green those that are considered optimal, which means are identified as the best formulations to provide WHO-recommended regimens, and we still see a lot of yellow lines. So despite of all those efforts, we still see high market fragmentation, and we still lack some child-friendly formulations. As explained by Carlo, the Pediatric Antiretroviral Drug Optimization Group have made an effort to list the priorities, to give guidance to industry on which are the products that can be developed. Based on that, and thanks to the fact that all the recommended products have been licensed to the Medicines Patent Pool, a group of organizations created a platform, is in the last column, called PHTI, Pediatric HIV Treatment Initiative, that has worked to translate some of these priorities into projects. And I will explain a little bit afterwards. But as we saw in the last slide, there's still a lot of challenges and a lot of market fragmentation. This is mainly due to the complexity of the projects, the internal lack of prioritization within these lists, lack of incentives, and the difficulty to have an effective market uptake. And the potential solutions that have been identified through these initiatives and through all the actions that we have done in the past is that we need more technical support and engagement with industry. We need to stage the paedo priorities, provide incentives, and provide regulatory strategies to support the filings. So, talking about engagement with industry, we saw a little bit, we saw from Carlo and from Elaine that clinical trials need to be shortened, so continue engaging with innovators to achieve that, to avoid sequential cohorts, and to avoid trials that don't use WHO weight bands. And this is something that has started over the years, but the GAP-F will do that in a more comprehensive manner and incorporate that to the activities. With genetics, to still continue working to avoid the market fragmentation, to engage them in this market, to make it interesting for them, and also to find mechanisms to mitigate the risk that it represents to enter the pediatric market. And as I said, paedo and PHTI have worked and have provided very valuable lessons. So what PHTI, one of the things that PHTI showed is that collaborating between different partners, and in particular this initiative was 5 organizations, it is 5 organizations, the NDI, Medicines Patent Pool, WHO, and CHI, and coordinated by Unitate, was very valuable and very useful to work on the paedo priorities and to become this, to translate that into projects that are some of them ongoing. In terms of technical support, there's been a lot of technical support given over the past years to avoid the problems. Basically, I mentioned three. Taste masking is a big issue when formulating pediatric drugs. Formulating drugs in fixed dose combinations when possible, and providing a formulation that can be used across weight bands. So the technical support done until now has been on patents and licensing, on availability of clinical data, information on dosing per weight band that was mentioned before with the Pediatric AIDS Working Group, for instance. This is just an example. Clinical development, regulatory issues, formulation and development, and financing this formulation development and clinical development, project management, and market size and uptake. These activities are more comprehensively taken into account into GAPF and are incorporated into the work plans. And my last slide is on staging paedo priorities. We realize paedo, although it's a short list, is difficult for manufacturers to really tackle. So what GAPF is doing is, based on some technical criteria, and I will not list them, I will not read them because of time, to show which is the most important formulation, but incorporating time as an element to the analysis, which is very important, which means not only say this product is more important because it will serve a larger number of children, but also incorporating the time that is needed until all data needed to develop the formulation and to reach the market is ready. So that allows company to understand and to see a mapping over the next years on what is needed and what can come first, so they can better use the resources. And Melinda will continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Fernando. Good morning, everyone. I will continue on the formulation development and regulatory presentation. So how do we solve the problems and the challenges and the issues that Fernando has just mentioned and that were also mentioned by Carlo and Elaine? One of the ideas that we have, and there are some work in progress to test some of these ideas, is about incentives. And I think when you say incentives, people assume it's only money. But it's not only money. It's also non-monetary incentives like the technical support, like the regulatory strategy. And so I think as a package of incentives, that is quite helpful to many of the generic suppliers. So for example, in product development, we hope that with a package of incentives that could include money as well as the technical support and the regulatory support, that can accelerate development significantly. It will allow suppliers to have access to information much more quickly than perhaps otherwise would happen. And it would be some critical information that would then help to avoid some of the missteps that may have been taken in the past, where perhaps the formulation that ultimately was developed was not optimal, or perhaps couldn't serve the entire spectrum of weight bands. Moving on into the market area, again, incentives can help support there. For example, one of the big barriers that we see is the process of commercialization with the generics. There's a certain amount of effort that needs to be expended for that, and when it's a new product that's coming out, there may be some hesitancy on the side of the buyers. And so you get into this log jam of not enough orders, or the work hasn't been done yet because they've not gotten enough orders. And so things like catalytic procurement or market shaping can help break that barrier so that these formulations can actually be accessed much more quickly post-approval than they have been historically. Moving on into the regulatory realm, there are a number of innovative strategies that can be developed. They're obviously product dependent, but it's not just a one-size-fits-all approach. And there are ways that you can come up with innovative strategies that can then accelerate not only the development, but also the filing aspect, and therefore what might be the review time. So, for example, through US FDA, and when you're talking about ARVs, that is a primary route that people take for filings, there are pre-IND consultation programs that can be utilized. And I think perhaps this has been less utilized in the generic space than, of course, it has been in the innovator space. And so we're really a proponent of having those conversations early and talking about what things can be done to accelerate this process. 505(b)(2) filings are another way. It's not necessarily only going to be a generic filing, and many times products may fit into another filing strategy. With WHO, they have a collaborative registration procedure, and that is certainly gaining momentum and in many areas has been quite successful. It is post-WHO pre-qualification, but what it does allow is for the countries that participate in the CRP process, it does allow for an accelerated registration at the national level. There are other barriers that we've encountered and issues that we've had to resolve. An example here is the Indian Regulatory Authority, DCGI, implemented a requirement for clinical trials in their population, which reasonable, right? And this was not just in pediatrics, but it's really to talk through with the authority what would work for the population and whether or not scientifically does this need to be done. And so I think that if you can engage at that level, then there are some of these barriers that you can overcome over time. So some examples with the innovative regulatory filing strategies. You obviously, appropriate data needs to be incorporated, and it's not necessarily just relying on the innovator data. So for some of the pediatric products that have been on the market for adults and potentially for pediatrics in high-income countries, depending on when that development program was done, the data may not have been collected using weight bands, and likely it was not collected using the weight band dosing that's recommended. So you could use modeling and simulation that can be incorporated into the generic filing to support an alternate dosing strategy that can then be much more effective in the LMIC markets. A common barrier, we hear this all the time from the suppliers, is around the use of reference listed drugs. What's the appropriate reference to use? And I think engaging early with any of the regulators that you plan to file with is critical to map out that plan so that there aren't studies that are wasteful and therefore need to be repeated if the wrong reference was used. So under a Unitaid grant to CHI called Optimal ARV, this is one of the incentive programs that we are currently working on, and we've just recently announced the partnership, and it's with Unitaid, ViiV, and CHI to develop the optimal pediatric formulation for dolutegravir, as was mentioned earlier, the 10 milligram score dispersible. So we've announced the awardees, who are Mylan and McLeod's. They do also have licenses with MPP, and we're working quite closely with them in this collaborative partnership to greatly accelerate the development of the dolutegravir single, such that we hope that it reaches the market significantly faster than it would otherwise have done. Things like this can also be used further downstream, as mentioned before, with things like catalytic procurement or other market-shaping interventions. So thank you.
Thanks to Fernando and Melinda. And now we will look at uptake and procurement of optimal formulations with Nandita Sugandhi from ICAP and Jennifer Kahn from EGFAF.
Good morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the procurement, the uptake, and the use of optimal formulations for children. No disclosures from either of us. And we'll talk a little bit about how you select those optimal formulations, what support is available for procurement of optimal formulations, and how do we transition to new optimal formulations as they become available, as well as pharmacovigilance. So as we all know, the uptake of preferred regimens has historically been really slow. In 2013, we had the recommendation to use LPVR as the preferred first line for infants and younger children, and yet here we are at the end of 2017, and at that point only 20% of children were receiving the preferred regimen, and furthermore, we're still seeing a lot of use of nevirapine, which is a suboptimal drug. So how do we accelerate the uptake of new formulations as they become available? I think there's some lessons learned from the past, and a good one is the introduction of the abacavir 3TC 120 milligram, 60 milligram scored dispersible tablet. Now again, abacavir is the preferred NRTI backbone for children, and as you can see from the table, we initially had a 60-30 dispersible tablet, which could be used across all weight bands. However, we had a lot of older children, and we were seeing a really high pill burden with use of that formulation. And so there was a request, can we make a double-strength tablet of the 120/60 to actually really decrease the pill burden, make it a lot easier for children. And so that product was developed, and it received FDA approval in October of 2014. It was priced pretty equivalent to the current 60-30 tablet. And we didn't expect that there would be much time before it was launched and became available. We included it on the optimal formulary, which Fernando mentioned earlier. And yet, even though we saw increasing use of abacavir 3TC, it took 2 years before the first order was placed for this formulation. So I think we can look back and think, why did it take so long, and how can we do better? So first and foremost, I think especially those from country programs can understand that there's concern about supply security. You want to make sure that something will be available. Sometimes we don't hear about the availability of new products. I don't think that's advertised widely, and there may not be widespread awareness. We don't include them automatically on procurement plans, and that lack of the orders that are placed to the suppliers results in a lack of communication. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation that we need to overcome. So how can we do better? Again, we have to work on awareness of the products as well as the necessity for change to optimal regimens. We do have limited availability that we have to overcome. We need to make sure that we overcome this inadequacy of guidance to healthcare workers on transitioning to new products or new regimens. And we have to solve this issue of the complicated quantification for different age groups and weight bands. So, in terms of how do we select those formulations and how do we communicate new formulations, the optimal pediatric formulary was designed to provide guidance to national programs, to procurement agencies, to manufacturers on the best options that we really want to promote to deliver all the required first and second line regimens for pediatric HIV patients. And we also have a limited use list that provides guidance on product selection for those time-limited circumstances or those special circumstances. And as we have new recommendations coming in about an hour or so, we've already updated the optimal formulary to be in line with the new 2018 WHO guideline update. So I think there may be some of you in the audience that are asking, it's great that we have a list of those formulations that we want to use, but what about availability? What if those drugs are not available? We don't want unicorns. We don't want a drug that's actually not real, that doesn't exist. We only include those formulations that have received stringent regulatory approval, but that does not automatically lead to availability. And availability of the pediatric formulations is a prerequisite for the actual implementation. So it's not enough to just develop a drug and have it be approved, and we need to make sure that it is available in country and to our patients. So this is impacted by supplier capacity to produce the amount that we need. It's also affected by in-country registration and licensing issues. And we really had to discuss, how do we deal with this issue of availability? Are those products that we have struggled with availability in the past, should we include those at all? And that includes some of the issues that we've had around the availability of LPVR 4010 oral pellets. So when it comes to the availability of products for our children, who is ultimately responsible for making sure that those are there? Is that the country program's responsibility? And I think we've thought about it that way for quite a while, but there's a paradigm shift that we have to start thinking about, and that it's not the country programs that are responsible. They make the policies to recommend the optimal regimens for children, but it's really pretty much everybody in this room that's responsible. It's the funding agencies, it's the suppliers, it's the procurement entities, it's the regulatory bodies that have to work together, and there's an enormous amount of coordination that has to happen to make sure that those formulations are available in country. And so luckily we have a coordinating body, the ARV Procurement Working Group, formerly the Pediatric ARV Procurement Working Group, the PAPWG, and this was established to improve the supply security for pediatric ARVs. This does this by coordinated procurement mechanisms, by strategically managing demand, and by advocating and supporting countries to use the IATT formulary, the current formulary, to procure, to streamline product selection and procure optimal formulations. So again, we moved from calling it the PAPWG to the APWG because this was a very successful model. It was made up of the major buyers of ARVs, which include the Global Fund, PEPFAR, UNICEF, and others, as well as other stakeholders. And we recognized that there was a need for this coordination process across not just pediatric ARVs, but also expanding the scope to those drugs that are challenged in terms of procurement for adolescents and adults. So they work to collate demand intelligence, share that with suppliers to ensure what's needed is going to be available at the time of ordering. They're monitoring market challenges and developments and communicating that in a timely way to country programs, and they're supporting the uptake of optimal products. I think at this point they've committed to making sure that those products that are listed on the optimal formulary or limited use list are going to be available when they are needed. So the successful uptake of a product requires multiple stakeholders, which includes the service providers who prescribe them, the regulatory authorities that approve them, the community for demanding them, to donors for making sure that they are procured, to implementing partners, and then to the procurement partners and suppliers who make those available in country, and ultimately the ministries of health as well for supporting the use of optimal regimens in their population. And we luckily have several new tools that can help all of the stakeholders to put this together. For example, we have the CHI Toolkit, the new product introduction toolkit that has a variety of resources to help with the selection of optimal products for both adults and some pediatric tools as well. AIDS-Free just launched the lopinavir-ritonavir pellet toolkit that again includes a lot of materials on training healthcare workers, guidance for caregivers on how to administer the pellets, for sort of planning and supply planning and procurement guidance as well. We also have the PAWG toolkit, which was mentioned earlier, and this has a specific chapter. Again, it's not enough to just develop the drug and have it approved, but we also have a specific chapter there on commercialization and introduction of new formulations. And lastly, with the update to the 2018 optimal formulary, we have developed simultaneously a transition brief to help programs and provide guidance on how to transition from our previous formulary to what is coming in new and is needed today. So with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Jen Cohn from EGPATH. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nandita, and thanks to the organizers for inviting us to speak. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the downstream and uptake issues. So this is really speaking to the no-do gap. Even when products are available, they're recommended, potentially even they are registered in country, what happens that it takes so long for our populations to actually get access to these drugs and actually start taking them? And this is the other side of the unicorn. And we don't want there to have to be a perfect model, but we know that we do have to focus on this to make sure that the patients who need these drugs actually get them. And this is a little bit of the process that actually has to happen in country in order for a drug to go from the dream, the imaginary state, to actually in the hand of a patient. So first the country needs to decide to adopt it. The product needs to be potentially listed on the essential medicines list and registered in country. And then there really needs to be a process of transition planning. What happens to the old medicines? Where do we put some of the new medicines? From that, you need to base your quantification. Then you actually need to procure things, and these may need to align with budgetary cycles. You need to engage all partners as you begin to plan for the actual transition while you're waiting for the lead time for the drug to come in country. And then you need to start planning both uptake at a central level and then critically at a facility level, because we need to make sure that those frontline healthcare workers know the drug is coming, when it's coming, how to use the drug, and what instructions to give to patients and caregivers on how to take the drug. And also to make sure that communities are involved in this education and awareness. And finally, after the drug is put out into our communities, how can we monitor the drug and make sure that it is acting in the way that we expect it to? So just a couple examples of what this might mean. So first, we might plan our rollout strategy. And what considerations do we have? What's the availability of the drug? What's the availability of our training resources? And do we need to consider a nationwide versus a phased enrollment? Is that phased enrollment based on populations, geography, which facilities might get this first? And all of these, again, you have to take into consideration what resources you have to actually make that transition. In terms of the supply chain, what existing stocks are currently in the supply chain, and what sort of transition between the old stocks and the new stocks can you plan? Can you have two different stocks existing at one facility, and does that create actually confusion for frontline healthcare workers and patients? And again, I want to stress, these procurement and supply chain issues must be aligned with budgetary cycles. And so that all has to line up to make sure that you can ideally have this unicorn of transitioning perfectly. And when you're budgeting, yes, of course, we always think we have to budget for the product, but that's not all. We have to make sure we're remembering to budget for those key activities: training, mentorship, community awareness, supportive supervision, especially up front with a new product. You need to make sure that it's being used in the intended way. So again, when we get down to training components, we have to unpack exactly what this means. So where do you plan the training? You need to align that with your rollout model and your transition plan. You need to think about, is the product going to actually be available at the time of training? And that's particularly important for pediatric products, where it's not just taking a pill. It might be dissolving in some water, it's stirring, it's washing the cup. All of these things need to be actually on the ground and trained and in healthcare workers' hands when you're doing the training, so they know how to use these products. And who do we train? And this may depend on country context. How task shifted are we with regards to ART initiation for pediatrics? Of course, we need to include monitoring and reporting, particularly pharmacovigilance when a new drug is rolled out. And again, we need to make sure that we're training people living with HIV, caretakers, and the community on what's coming, when it's coming, and what it can mean. So all of these things really need to be taken into account when we're preparing our training model for a transition. So I want to also make sure that we don't leave out a very key stakeholder, and that's the people who will be administering the drugs and giving the drugs to our children, or who will be taking the drugs. And I want to bring in an example from tuberculosis. I know we're an HIV group here, and we've been talking mostly about HIV, but as others have mentioned, we're not just thinking about HIV within the GAP-F. We recognize we have to take some of these lessons learned and apply them to other areas where drugs are similarly slow to be introduced for pediatric populations. And in tuberculosis, we recently, as a result of a Unitaid-funded grant, got a new fixed-dose, dispersible, good-tasting drug for first-line TB in children. And this is kind of a revolution. And what we as EGPAF are doing is actually trying to make sure that it actually gets to patients. And all of our kind of countries that we're working in said, yes, the drug is rolled out, the drug has been procured, but when we went to facility level, the drug was not at facility level. caretakers were not aware that it was even coming, they didn't know anything about it, and clinicians didn't know when this drug was going to hit their facility, even if they'd heard about it. So we have to not just focus on HIV. If we really want to take care of the child in a holistic way, we have to make sure we're applying all of these lessons to other comorbidities such as tuberculosis. And finally, pharmacovigilance. We all want to move fast. This is critical, but we have to take off and fly with a safety net. And that's when I'm talking about pharmacovigilance. And we can talk about several different types. Active pharmacovigilance, this is basically kind of more formal observational and cohort studies. And these are actually critical when you're rolling out to a large population a drug, especially when we want to try and get it out there in a very accelerated way. But for the most part, we're going to be talking about passive pharmacovigilance. And this may rely on actually some additional trainings and support for stimulated pharmacovigilance, especially when a drug is first rolled out. And we want to keep an eye on the long game. Infants and children are going to be ideally on these drugs for life or until we find a cure. And we need to make sure that we're considering the long-term effects of ARVs and not just stop pharmacovigilance during the first few months after they start a drug. So these toxicity concerns may be different from adults, and they deal with the developmental stages of the child. So we have to also take that into consideration when we are planning for what our pharmacovigilance systems will look like. So in closing, I want to say that all of these things take funding, they take advanced planning, and they take longer-term investment. And that's what we, as all of the stakeholders that Nandita mentioned, need to invest in order to make sure that our products are available, adapted, and in patients' hands as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to Nandita and Jennifer. So now we'll look at these questions in more details from the audience. So this is your opportunity to ask questions. Just a couple of things I would like to highlight before we move to that. So we've heard that collaboration is of essence. It's really important, and that's why we have such a diverse panel. Please take advantage of that. One thing that everyone has mentioned, but it's not represented on the panel here, is industry. Industry engagement is essential from originators and generics, and we've been working on this throughout the different processes and mechanisms in place, including also with the IS Industry Liaison Forum. For your information, slides and a webcast will be made available after. So all these technicalities, if you didn't have time to catch everything, you will have an opportunity to get a copy. And so if you have questions, this is the right time. And then after the question period, we'll move into a different kind of presentations, looking at the GAP-F in more details, how it will work and what it will do, and having a diverse panel from external stakeholders. Any question? Yes, please.
Good morning. Thank you for a good presentation. My name is Olawale Salami from DNDi. So I have a question regarding the engagement with regulatory agencies. What we have seen so far is that there's a lot of inconsistencies with what the guidelines from the FDA, with the MCC and the EMA. We see that the requirements for clinical trials that are needed for registration and especially for fixed dose combinations, they're very, very divergent, and we see there's a lot of inconsistencies. So I'm wondering what the GAP-F is going to do to be able to align these regulatory agencies and also with the national agencies, such that there is a lot of clarity in what is needed to get drugs registered for children.
Thank you for your question. I completely agree. We have seen a lot of disparity amongst the agencies, and that is definitely one of the goals within GAP-F is to align better. As you know, that's typically quite product dependent, and so I think the earlier that you can engage, the better. I think that we will be looking toward that, especially with regards to the priority products for children, and have those plans in place early and continue those conversations. We have been successful so far in various areas with very sound scientific rationale around what an approach would be for a particular product. And that's really the approach we will continue to take. We think that the scientific justification should really rule the day there, but still keeping in mind that we do want to address their concerns because their requirements are not necessarily just because they do have concerns about certain things, and so we want to keep that in mind as well.
Thanks, Melinda. Question here?
polyclonal HIV base, and I'm a terrible linguist, so I hope this is a correct pronunciation of your name, Sharifa. Thank you so much for telling us how horrible it is to take nasty tasting medicines. And I just wanted to know from you if you were able to have your medicines in a different way, maybe like in an implant or a patch, or with longer periods in between taking them every day. Would that be something that would make your life better? And I must say, whatever you're doing a very good job. You look great. So and I haven't seen anybody in a tiara on a panel first thing in the morning before at an AIDS conference. So congratulations.
Thank you so much for that question. Back then there was no those kinds, and if it was me here, if it was me at 6 years here, I would definitely tell you I need the injection,
okay,
or I need a medicine that I could take for 3 months, 3 months, and I take it like today, and I don't need to take it again. We are all looking at being in school, and you're a child, you need to go in boarding sections, and you're in a school of many kids, and every time you pull out your drugs, they're like, why are you always taking medication? Why is it that? So if there was that injection that you could take, you take it in the early days, and you go back home, you go back home, you take another injection, so kids won't ask you, why are you taking these medications? Why that? Because they won't even know that you're on injection or something like that. So it would have been so better if they were there.
Okay, so we need to also globally accelerate. I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but long-acting formulations and extended release. And Jen Cohen, thank you very much for your pharmacovigilance slide.
Thanks, Sharifa. Thanks, Polly. Still behind?
Yes, Craig McClure from Canada. I wanted to congratulate everyone working on the GAP-F, friends and colleagues, for a long time. And I hope it works out well. But frankly, over the last 20 years, we all know that pediatrics has been a disaster. And every time we've tried to come together and accelerate them, we failed. And adults living with HIV would never have stood for this over the last 20 years. My question is perfect follow-up to Polly's question, actually, in relation to long-acting technologies. So we have the first long-acting HIV treatment in the final stages of clinical trials, cabotegravir and rilpivirine, which will be either delivered as a 1-month or every 2-month injection, and likely will be approved for sale if everything continues to go well next year for adults. In 2017, Rajith et al. From University of Liverpool and Johns Hopkins published in Clinical Pharmacology the optimal predicted doses for various weight bands for children between the ages of 3 and 18 using physiologically based PK data. And yet still, rilpivirine and cabotegravir are not in a clinical trial for children and adolescents. Can you update us, anyone on the panel, around, is anything happening there? Is anything likely to happen there, and when? Thank you.
There's a clinical trial for cabotegravir, which is anticipated to begin, I think, by the end of this year.
Okay, so the deferral is off.
So what's that?
The deferral. There's been a deferral on testing it in children.
It's not a deferral.
There was a deferral.
I'm sorry?
There was a deferral placed on trials of cabotegravir and rilpivirine.
So it was initially only studied 18 and above. After quite a bit of work, there's been an agreement and development of a clinical trial to study it in younger or smaller children.
That's terrific. So that's the cabotegravir.
I can't speak to the rilpivirine.
Because, of course, you need both. And rilpivirine, of course, has the heat stability problems. But nevertheless.
But rilpivirine also, there are issues around the use of NNRTIs, in experienced children. So it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, complicated topic. I encourage you to get in touch after. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Ellen. One last question from the front, and then we'll take others in the panel later. We have to move forward. We're a bit late, so very short, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Patricia Mwashingwele, Member of Parliament from the Zambian Parliament, Central Africa. I would like to congratulate all of you for that presentations, but I have two observations maybe and one quick question to Sharifa, which will be answered by the panelists. I'm looking at Zambia, and if you're looking at research, I'm sure you know that the pediatric section of our country is the largest section of the users of the ARVs. Is it possible that they could be given to children as they go to under 5 clinic? Because you find the same mothers have to take 2 trips, and sometimes the distances are very long for a parent to do 2 trips in 1 week. But if they give them at the under 5 clinic, it actually happens at the same time, simultaneously, and the mother doesn't have to undertake 2 trips. Thank you so much.
Anybody wants to comment rapidly on this?
Maybe I can briefly comment. So EGPAF has been, along with other implementers, have been supporting integrated models of care that are much more family-centered and attempt to provide care to multiple different members of the family within one visit, because we know that this is a major barrier to ask families to come back for individual visits at different times, even at different physical spaces. And we have seen that this does seem to increase retention in care. So I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards to talk a little bit about our models. Thanks.
And I would just say to that, you know, we would see you as bringing that back to your country and saying this is imperative to improve the outcomes for children and for women and families. And we need more advocacy on a local level to really push all of this work down to kids receiving the right drugs.
Fantastic. Thanks for the answers. Thanks to the speakers. We'll now shift gears, and I will invite the 2 next speakers, Martina Penazzetto from WHO and Paul Domenico from CHAI. They will talk about what the GAP-F is, what it will do, and how.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us at this satellite today. So Paul and I are going to tag team, and we're going to tell you a little bit more about how we plan to build on everything you've heard so far and to really take it to the next level and see how it can work better and more sustainably. So we don't have any conflict to declare. And I think it's important to start from the concept that the Global Accelerator goal is really to give an important contribution to ensure success of the Sustainment Development Goal number 3, and really ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all children of all ages. So we know we will be addressing the needs of children that are a vulnerable population that do not receive and do not have the medication that are needed to address the health needs that they have. We know that the best drugs and dosage formulation for these children are not currently available. That's for HIV and for many other diseases in low and middle income countries. And we know that clinical research is lacking behind to define appropriate pediatric doses. We know that pediatric formulation do not exist for most drugs, and we know that the time to market and product development, all the way from product development to uptake, lags quite behind. So behind adults by over a decade. So the plan of GAP-F is really to cover all infectious diseases as a start and really use the lesson learned from HIV to accelerate the research, development, and introduction of new pediatric products. So you've seen this visual a number of times by now, but it really represents what GAP-F as a collaborative platform will aim to do. We'll have a focus on key pediatric products that will be prioritized, taken through clinical research, developed in the right formulation, and then approved by SRAs and then by national regulatory authorities, and then procured, introduced, and monitored over time. We know that this collaborative platform will need to be supported by the innovative financing mechanism that promotes a faster, more efficient, and more focused approach to pediatric clinical formulation development and introduction. So in other words, we will really address the full life cycle of a given product and take it through this chain of actions in a way that is smooth, sustainable, and efficient. How will we do that? We will do that by engaging with key donors to support the entire product life cycle, moving away from the siloed approach that so far has been used. We'll also create and maintain a product portfolio that addresses the treatment needs and really capture the prioritization approach that was mentioned earlier today. We will support the development of flexible and fit-for-purpose PIPs and PSPs in close collaboration with innovators and with regulatory authorities. And we will coordinate clinical research goals that will be critical to accelerate the generation of data to inform drug development and introduction. We will also provide market analytics to support decision across stages of the program life cycle and to inform further prioritization in the portfolio. We will design, implement, and full product commercialization plans that will enable acceleration of the introduction of products. We'll further coordinate efforts between suppliers, innovators, research networks, regulators, procurers, Ministry of Health and Ministry of Finance, and regulatory bodies that will be there to work all together to make this happen more quickly. We will deploy a business model that will be more efficient, sustainable, and that will be able to unlock all the barriers that have been mentioned earlier and facilitate the actions, the critical actions that will be needed throughout the product life cycle. How will we do that?
So to take all those challenges and attempt to respect the initiatives that each organization is currently working on, but to identify ways to improve collaboration, focus attention on deliverables that are consistent, of high quality. We have to add some structure that allows independent organizations to work as one. And so that's what a lot of GAP-F is trying to do, is to take this very complex flow of information and effort from the beginning of demonstrating safety and efficacy in adults to ensuring that children are living better and longer lives with products. We have to organize ourselves. And we will do that in three major buckets. The first bucket is to prioritize and evaluate. The second bucket is to develop, and that's the business and technical end of ensuring that a product goes from idea to a substance and a product, and then to deliver. We are in the process of creating a business plan, and it is a very collaborative exercise, and as a consequence, it will take time for us to realize that business plan. But it has to have support and buy-in from a number of critical parts of the global health community. It must include coordination with industry, with regulatory bodies, with governments, with a lot of the people that are in this room representing one or another organization. And this does look like an industrial organizational chart, and that's actually on purpose, to add some business acumen to the great work that is done by the NGOs that are currently devoted to saving children's lives. So over the course of time, we will move from a collection of independent organizations to a group of organizations that are committed to a common business plan, a common business model, and a shared approach to seeking funding. We will move from a consortium and perhaps in due course to a standalone entity that collaborates with existing organizations. To make that happen, we also have to have a strong collaboration and engage in a journey with donors, with existing donors and new types of donors. Donors that may come from industry, from social capital, from other sources that we have not tapped into date. And we also need to take the investment that's being made by existing and new donors and make sure they complement. Make sure that as we move from the beginning of the life cycle of a product to the end, that there are no gaps, that there's a complement of funding, and that that funding amount is sustainable to ensure that the products themselves are developed, but also the good work that's necessary to prioritize the portfolios across diseases,
and do the science necessary to demonstrate safety and efficacy all the way down to newborns, and to create a funding envelope that allows GAP-F to do what it needs to do.
So as we further define the details of GAP-F, we've already started to deliver. And here in this slide, you can see on the left a toolkit that was developed by a number of different partners and members of the Pediatric RV Working Group to accelerate research and development and introduction of products. And it's been mentioned already a number of times, and I would, if you don't have this card, please take it with you when you leave the room, because you have the links to be able to access this document. This document was a critical process to define standards of how to accelerate this process more globally, and it has been reviewed by regulatory bodies as well as by industry. So we really feel that this point in time, it represents the best that we can do in this area of work. On the right side of the slide, you can see a document that was issued by the US FDA. And while we can't, of course, take the credit for the great work that FDA has done, we can, of course, note that our dialogue has started a long time ago. And while some of the actions around regulatory processes will have to depend on products, there's also some critical review of the existing principles that can happen. And that's exactly what we've done all together. We've reviewed it critically and agree on key principles that have then been endorsed by US FDA and more formally issued through this guidance that is now out there. We're also going to build on the work that has already happened in the past, but just accelerate it. As Nandita said earlier, we have changed the guidelines in May 2018. 4 weeks later, we had an optimal formulary already developed with a transition tool that will be out there available to support countries in transitioning to optimal products.
So you've heard this a number of times, and you're going to keep on hearing it because it's part and parcel to how we ensure that GAP-F in fact does deliver some value, and it's not just one extra NGO that finds its way into the cornucopia. So we will be building a business plan and hope to finalize that by the end of this year. And as I said, it's very collaborative, and in due course we'll be sharing it with everybody and hope to hear back from you on how you think it could be in fact improved further. We need to be able to define clearly what each partner brings to the table and what they're responsible for, accountable for. We need to figure out how to make decisions together and commit to those decisions. And we need to have honest conversations around what new opportunities there are for funding to ensure that the promise that is resident in this initiative is realized, which will take us a while. We need to continue discussions with partners outside of the HIV space to ensure that we understand how the GAP-F model can add value to the work that they do. We need to reach out to industry partners to work on refining our plans, make sure that there's support and collaboration and alignment with how they see themselves going forwards, and have the frank conversation around what could GAP-F do to accelerate further their work? What would we have to do in partnership with them? And so there will be conversations that are starting this week, in fact, and this afternoon, in fact, to talk about opportunities to accelerate work. And finally, we will be prioritizing the work of the portfolios on non-HIV drugs starting very soon and predicated on the paedo 3 model. So please stay connected with us. Please reach out and introduce yourself if there's an idea you have, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you.
So in the interest of time, I'd like to invite all our panelists for this session to join us at the table. And as they do so, I think that the purpose of this panel is very much to touch on two key points that Paul and I have already mentioned. And the first one is really how do we go beyond HIV and how do we use the HIV experience to really inform other disease areas, and how can we work together and join forces in an effective way so that we can move forward together. And the second point really refers to the resources that will be required in order to do that, and thinking creatively about a different business model that can support this area of work in a much more sustainable way and also in a much more innovative way. So we have a number of panelists that have joined us and represent different organizations. And so I'll start with addressing the first point around integration and really collaboration between the HIV community with other disease areas. And I'd like to, we have as a member of our panel two esteemed colleagues. We have Viveka Kashubska, who is the Director of Product Development in MMV, and that obviously will share some of her thoughts in the area of malaria development and reflect on some of the great work that has undergone within MMV. And we have Isabelle Andrieux-Meyer, who is the medical clinical lead in the pediatric HIV and HCV program in the NDI, that will also build on some of the experience that the NDI has matured over time over a broader, over a set of different disease areas. So with that, I'd really like to get your perspective and really invite both of you to share your reflections about what are the common pain points and what are the common solutions that we can use. I'd like to hear if, going through some of the presentations that we heard today, there are specific concepts that resonate particularly with you and the work that your organization has done, and whether you feel that these would work for your disease areas. We'd also like to hear whether you feel that GAPF can really add value to the work that you're already doing, and whether you have any consideration to share with regards to the work that needs to be done from now on to really make sure that other disease areas are captured by the work of GAPF. Maybe we'll start from Viveka. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was fascinating to learn all the details of GAPF. And I'm very much encouraged by what you're doing and the mission that you're setting up for yourself, because there are so many parallels that I'm sure we'll be benefiting from as well. So malaria, as you said, might be slightly a little bit ahead on the curve of making affordable and available pediatric formulations, but by no means are we there yet in the journey. So I was struck by a number of similarities, particularly in clinical development. So, or maybe just one word about malaria for the audience. We still have about 500,000 deaths with malaria globally, and overwhelming majority in under 5, children under 5 years old. So in that sense, pediatric population is our target population, and that maybe is making it a little bit easier. So what we have done most recently for the new classes of antimalarials, we are incorporating young children in phase 2 trials for sure. Most of phase 1 safety is done still in adults, but in phase 2 we start with greater than 12 years old children and then go down in age-wise. And because we do that, it also means that we have to have a formulation ready for testing, and that speeds up the whole CMC process so that we have granule forms of combinations of drugs, and they might be loose, they become fixed combinations maybe in phase 3. And I think that's what you're aiming to do in general in your clinical development. So I think we can benefit from each other's experience there quite a bit. Then moving on, moving backwards to some of the older antimalarials that we're still using in the field do not have pediatric formulations. So we've done with our partners, Unitate in particular, a lot of work in getting new formulations. And there, the issues might be similar to what you were describing in your excess part of the presentation, where even if we have a dispersible tablet now, parents are apparently still crushing the old adult tablets and giving them on a spoon to a child. So there must be a reason for that, which we may not understand. So I took a good note of your, I think it's called transition brief, and we'll be reading it with great interest to see if we can learn from there. And I think I could go on, but maybe I should stop and give the podium to my colleague here.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. As you know, Drug for Neglected Disease initiative has been created by Doctors Without Borders with the money from the Peace Nobel Prize. And we are proud to have a mix of people coming from the industry and people coming from the humanitarian world. Over time, the NDI has worked on developing malaria treatment for children with artesunate amodiaquine. 3 different doses has been developed for the children. For visceral leishmaniasis, where half of the children get infected and they are below 12 years of age, we have developed miltefosine for them with the safety, efficacy, PK data. For Chagas, we have developed also the pediatric dose for benzidazole. And for pediatric HIV, we work with CIPLA for the lopinavir, ritonavir, 3TC, abacavir 4-in-1, which is coming really very close to its here. And the bioequivalent studies are ongoing now in India, and the drug will be submitted to FDA before the end of this year. We work also for neglected people, and we work for people living with hepatitis, notably hepatitis C, to develop for them a very affordable combination that will cost 1% of what they should pay if they take the drugs on the market. So if we take a little bit on what DNDi and GARDP are doing together, I will take now the example of what's happening in terms of neonatal sepsis, where traditionally, and this is what I started working with when I was a very young doctor, ampicillin, gentamicin was and remains quite the only treatment you can give to treatment. But today there are very high rates of resistances. And GARDP has decided to develop a global pediatric antibiotic platform. And this is close to probably what GARDP, what this initiative now is looking like. And if we can put together this expertise in terms of medical knowledge, statistical, PK, clinical trial design, to facilitate the development of master protocols that will be not only the best possible technically speaking, but also design that will be okay for the regulatory authorities, we probably will spare time. And this makes immediately a link with diagnostics, because in the previous session, Rosanna Pilling was insisting again on the lack of diagnostics for hepatitis this time, but you can generalize many times. How do we make the diagnostics for children? And do we have the right tools for them? And in many situations, the answer is no. And we just extrapolate what we know from the adults. And again, this initiative should link with the diagnostics so that we have a better channel there and a better reliability. We cannot insist enough on the need to harmonize the regulatory requirements. Country by country, the requirements differ. Regulatory by regulatory body, they differ. And sometimes if you talk to FDA, you can have a very straightforward pathway, but this is not at all what you will have to face if you want to register in South Africa. And for pediatric HIV, South Africa, for example, is a very important partner. So in this platform, the discussion should not contain only the most important regulatory bodies, but also those who have a very heavy weight to play in terms of where the people to treat are, because their requirements have to be understood very rapidly so that the designs of the trial can contain these requirements, and so that we don't lose months and years having to repeat trials. And also we discover, or we have today to give more importance on the specific needs related to neonates. And this platform that you are creating now, that we are creating now, is really a good one. We had these 2 last days, we had 2 days dedicated to pediatric HIV, and our privilege was to be able to talk directly to the best possible experts of the world about what would be the best dose for abacavir, for 3TC, for a neonate, for lopinavir, for example. But this is only an example of what this platform can bring to really fasten also the design of a very good combination. Allow me now to be provocative. I come from Doctors Without Borders, so the challenge also from this initiative will be not to create additional monopoly situations, but to keep the diversity in those who decide to take the risk to develop pediatric formulations, and not all of them belong to the very powerful and rich industrial pharmaceutical companies. Some of them are generic manufacturers who take the risk to engage into the development of new chemical entities or new fixed dose combinations, and they take the risk to engage into an incredible new field for them, which costs money, which costs time, requests energy that were allocated to other fields. And we need to give them a chance of success too. One size does not fit all in pediatric development. We cannot say that one combination will treat all the children forever. This is not the reality, and we know that. So we need to ensure that we will keep a field for these different alternatives the children will need over time and according to their comorbidities. We cannot tell you how much time we take on the palatability, on the acceptability of this drug development, so that we make sure that the child will be able to accept it. I would take an example, a very stupid one. This one, lopinavir, ritonavir, abacavir 3TC dose mask, a powder designed for the newborn so that he doesn't really understand that he's taking a drug. If we went to WHO PQ with this, they told us, you don't cope with the requirement for the syrup. It's not 40% alcohol, so you will not be eligible to WHO PQ because you have changed the formulation. So sometimes I don't understand the rules anymore because it's totally, we have done it because the children cannot take 40% alcohol every day, 2 times a day. So sometimes also there are some elements that could be improved also there.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think that your contributions were very helpful to remind us a number of things. One, that we definitely need to work together and learn from each other, because the HIV may not be a proof of concept that fully adapt to other disease areas, but also that we can learn from others, like in the malaria field. You've really flagged the need to think about the uptake work and in conjunction, for example, some of the diagnostic initiatives that will open the need for the drugs and the medications that we're trying to develop. But you also flagged an important point with your last comment, which is really the regulatory aspect, which I think that it's been touched a number of times as really an important common element that cuts across disease areas. And I want to also add a contribution from our colleagues in WHO that works in the EMP department, and they're really moving ahead with consolidating and revamping a pediatric regulatory network that is really geared at ensuring that there's no disconnect between stringent regulatory authorities and national regulatory authorities. And I think there is really a lot that is being planned over the next year and a half. So we'll definitely go back to that, and I think that's something that definitely fits the goal and the mission of GAPF overall. So thank you again. And unfortunately, we didn't have anyone from the TB community, but rest reassured that this is an ongoing discussion that we are having with the TB community. There is a prioritization exercise that is being planned, and we are actively reaching out to some of the key partners that many of you know, among those TB Alliance, that will be really critical in working with us as we move forward with this. And with this, I would like to hand over to Paul with the next part of the panel.
Thank you, Martina. So I'm going to shift the conversation to talk a little bit more about the business of developing pediatric products and the funding necessary to do that. And in this conversation, I'll turn first to Taryn Barker, who's from CIF, and then to Robert Matiro from Unitate, and then George Cyberry from the Office of U.S. Global AIDS Coordination to address a few key topics. Taryn, from your perspective, how do you see GAPF adding value?
Sure. It's been really exciting for us at CIF to follow the development of GAPF over the last couple of years or so, because I think it's a really interesting opportunity for crowding in new funders like us into the space of pediatric development. For those who don't know SIF, we're the largest children's foundation in the world, but that still means we're an absolute drop in the bucket compared to global health investment. And so although we have made a number of investments in market shaping, it's always very challenging for us to figure out what really is the catalytic element that we can bring to the situation. Also, perhaps of interest is we're a foundation that's quite special and unique because we're founded by a hedge fund manager, which means that for us, return on investment is absolutely critical. And what GAPF really can bring to us, which we can't do when we're just investing on our own, is that portfolio approach of being able to invest in something that some products might fail along that very long cascade of potential bottlenecks that Jen Cohn showed us earlier, but also that it really makes a difference for us in being able to make bets that are more likely to succeed by really bringing together all of this different expertise across a number of different areas and really being able to do things differently. I think the other thing that's quite unique about this and being able to bring many different funders together is being able to bring in different types of capital. And so for an organization like SIF, we're quite flexible in the way that we can fund. And so we may be small in terms of the amount we can grant, but we're large in terms of our balance sheet. And so being able to look at innovative financing models where you can leverage our funding for volume guarantees or different structures or potentially even offering social impact bond models off of our resources is quite interesting to us. So I think those are some of the things that we think are quite exciting about this accelerator and really being able to have a very small amount of money on the part of a foundation really have catalytic impacts.
Thank you, Taryn. Robert, would you be willing to share some thoughts on what you think Unitaid and other donors might be willing to do to coordinate investment across this broad life cycle of product development, and what would GAPF have to deliver to meet your expectations?
No, thank you very much. The thing about coordination is it doesn't happen by itself, and oftentimes when you see global initiatives such as these come about, you tend to ask yourselves what took so long. Because it's so obvious that this type of global coordination is necessary. I think the encouraging thing about GAPF and its potential to be transformative is that there's a very important foundation that already exists to leverage what it wants to do. You saw earlier the continuum of research and prioritization, development, and then delivery. And what has been established in the last few years are effective coordination mechanisms in each of these three buckets, but nothing to bring them all together in that life cycle continuum. And so what's exciting here is you have an organization such as WHO, which has the global presence, knowledge, and credibility to be able to play that coordination role, but is positioning itself to partner with organizations, for example, such as CHI, that can bring the operational coordination on the ground to pull this all together. Unitaid has spent a lot of time, effort, and resources investing in the delivery work stream and the delivery work, as you saw earlier, through spearheading the pediatric ERB procurement working group, which has now become a broader group led by the Global Fund, setting up the PHTI, which continues today to take paedo priorities and operationalize them into actual products, supporting the WHO pre-qualification program, and working with industry to provide incentives that you saw through the CHI introduction. And so that piece is there, but again, we need to link all these pieces together to have the full picture and puzzle. And so for that to happen, we do need this type of coordination. And what is really useful about it is, as a funder and a global development investor, like SIF, we want to see return on investment and value for money. And when you bring partners as multifaceted as this initiative will do together, which cover normative agencies, industry, implementers, etc., then you're pooling collective intelligence and knowledge, which often exists in a siloed way. You're bringing together multiple perspectives, both from bottom-up, civil society, those who are affected, governments, as well as from global funders and global agencies. You're ensuring complementarity. Again, it's not self-evident that that happens by itself. It should, but it doesn't. So you need to ensure there's alignment, that funders are speaking to each other. What are they funding in different countries? What are they prioritizing? And also, very effectively, it brings together planning, but not short-term planning, long-term planning and life cycle planning, which is what GAPF is pushing for. right from when pediatric investment plans, pediatric investigation plans are being put together, right through to when we intend to put a product in country, and having the time from 5 to 9 years to 2 to 3. And that planning is what will also come, and GAPF is developing a business plan that will enable us to look at that planning as we go out, which again is really critical. So we're really encouraged by this. It's going to take a lot of work, but as you saw, it's already started. We're already starting to see results. But the most encouraging thing is we have a strong foundation. Each of those 3 buckets need to be brought together, but the foundation is there.
Thank you, Robert. George, last but not least, I'd like to ask you a 2-part question to get your thoughts from your perspective and your organization's perspective on the value of GAPF, but also I'd like to hear some thoughts on novel funding opportunities. We've spoke about it or intimated it. We haven't kind of spelled it out, but just some thoughts on how GAPF might be able to look for different sorts of funding.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. And I'd like to highlight that Ambassador Birx came to help open this meeting, and that is really a sign of how at the highest levels of our organization there's strong support for this agenda. And while we're clearly motivated by the promise for delivering better on pediatric ARVs, we recognize and see the high value on the benefit to other diseases as well. I think the fact that we've already been able to demonstrate through our collaborative work that FDA saw the need to release guidance that I think is game-changing for all of us in terms of clinical trial design for pediatric products is a concrete success that matters. And the work on advancing the pediatric dolutegravir development by Chai and others in the group, another success that I'm sure will come to fruition. But in essence, we've built this machine. We've shown the gears on the picture of the machine. We have to now demonstrate that this machine can function, that it works, and that it really will produce the results that we're after. And I think that's where the business case is really critical, to prove to the donors, prove to the community, prove to people who've invested in, who believe in this, that we're going to get out of this what we're looking for. And I see that in sort of 3 buckets. It's looking at the prioritized products, it's looking at process goals, and then it's understanding how you're going to manage to pay for the administrative aspects of this. And I think we have a clear source of information for which products are prioritized, and breaking that down into the tasks with timelines and specific budgets with milestones is going to be the way I think that you can attract investment by different donors for the aspects that they think are most important to their agenda, and that they can then, as a group, contribute to make the whole process work. I think that it's also key that we think about things like catalytic procurements. For instance, U.S. government can't do advance market commitments, but catalytic procurements are something that we see as a potentially excellent strategy for GAPF that can break the cycle of drug companies needing to know how much drug they need to make, and us and others having difficulty estimating how much we're going to need. So I think that sort of innovative approach can really make a big difference in moving things down the line. In terms of processes, I think there's more to do to make sure that the FDA guidance for the right way to do clinical trials in kids actually gets taken up. I think we've talked a lot about the need to get the regulatory processes aligned, and collaborative regulatory processes, we think, are an essential area that can be improved and developed that will be good for all involved. And then finally, we've talked about long-acting formulations for specific products, but I think having GAPF invest in innovators who can come up with novel formulation ideas that may apply across different medications for different diseases that will also be key. Finally, the work doesn't get done by all volunteers. And so I think we recognize that there does need to be some funding and commitment to the administrative and management aspects for this machine to be operated and to work right. And while I think we can agree from an even business perspective that an initial commitment to have that happen is one thing, I think part of the business case will be to ensure that you build into the costs of the individual tasks and projects the administrative aspects that keep it self-fulfilling and self-propagating. And I think altogether, those would be what would keep it appealing for us, where we'd see the value, the ability to measure the outcomes, the outputs, the successes that show us we're getting the return on the investment. Thanks.
Thank you very much, George. So we have our marching orders, don't we? All right, and it's a good bit to handle. We are running a little bit short on time, so I will not summarize this section, but you heard it. So I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian for closing comments.
Very good. Thanks to the panel. So I think we've seen the seed of a lot of progress and enthusiasm moving forward. So I'd like to call the panel, thank the panel again. We'll call Gottfried Ernschon from the WHO to join Robert Matiru from Unitaid for closing remarks. But before we do that, I'd like to mention that we have a flyer for key publications and also the website of the GAP-F outside. The website is www.gap-f.org. And we have a contact web page there if you want to be on our mailing list for progress updates. So, Robert, do you want to provide some closing remarks?
Thank you. So a few remarks from me before I hand over to Gottfried to close this session. So I think what I'm going to talk about is very briefly what to watch out for. The GAP-F is as much about the present as it is about the future. And I think as we look into 2019, we'll already see some very concrete deliverables that could help advance the goal of getting more children onto effective ART treatment. One of those is the advent of better diagnostics. We can't treat kids unless we can actually diagnose them. And this year, for the first time, we'll see the most comprehensive rollout of point-of-care diagnostics for infant testing. And it was very encouraging to see several countries under the PEPFAR COPS include point-of-care EID in their funding plans for 2019. And we now have product affordably priced that's going to be able to do that. Secondly, we hope to have FDA approval of the 4-in-1 ABC3TC lopinavir-ritonavir towards the end of 2019, and DNDi in partnership with CIPLA and also in coordination with Unitaid and others with Mylan are hoping to have two products come to market towards the end of 2019 that will be critical for under 3s. Taste mass, heat stable, and easier for kids to take. As you saw from the CHAI intervention, we have an incentive fund program running to bring scored 10 milligram DTG also for children to market as quickly as possible. That's moving quickly. The funding is committed. So together with Unitaid, ViiV, CHAI, and then two generic manufacturers, McLeod's and Mylan, we're moving aggressively so that DTG can also be available for children. You'll hear, obviously, in the coming months about the work of the Rome Action Plan, a very important coordination initiative to end pediatric HIV, and that is bringing the type of alignment we're talking about globally and at country to across multiple dimensions. And then lastly, GAP-F is also about integration. So we're not only talking HIV here, we're talking about putting children at the center of the approach. And so these kids are affected by HIV, they're affected by TB, they're affected by multiple indications. And that's why we have to take approaches both for diagnosis as well as treatment that address more than one type of disease. And that's what's also so promising about this. It's taking integration and actually operationalizing it, not paying lip service to it. So some critical things to look out for in 2019 as we lay the foundation for the business plan for the 5 or more years beyond that to be forward-looking. Gottfried, over to you.
Thanks, and I'm sorry I wasn't with you throughout the whole session. There's quite a few other events going on, but I hear you really had a great exchange, a great session. Just to somewhat paraphrase or rephrase what's just been said by Robert, clearly, in summary, children are still getting infected, are still not getting the best drugs in the formulations they need. That's why we are here. We are in this together, and I think the whole GAP-F model, I think, is really a good model of partnership. But it's also clear we need acceleration. We can't do business as usual. And as George has said, we need concrete results. It's not just about the warm feeling about talking about this. We need to have very clear milestones. We need to have very clear accountability and monitoring of these results. I think we have a solid ground to build on. There's a number of engagement opportunities that already exist. I won't go into the details. You know them. But there's enough enthusiasm and enough commitment to really move this forward. And again, this will depend, or the success will very much depend on having industry as a strong partner. And I think some of the events that have taken place demonstrate there is willingness, there is openness, there is not always the follow-up that we would like to see happening, but from WHO side, and I guess from sort of the network side, we clearly want to continue to have the pressure, but also the inclusiveness into this process. Need for concrete action, need for joint forces, but need for accountability. From a WHO side, we are really excited about this. And when I say we, this is not just the HIV department. We have discussed with our essential medicines program. We have taken this to the highest level within the organization. Dr. Tedros is aware of this. We see ourselves as a convener within WHO, but also for the broader initiative that's ongoing. And as just been said by Robert, the reason why WHO is excited is, of course, about HIV and getting sort of the HIV formulations to kids, but it's really about the broader potential, about the broader need for pediatric formulations that go beyond HIV, and obviously linking this very much, and you are aware of the UHC agenda that is very much being pushed and promoted at this point by Dr. Tedros, but obviously by all of us. GAPF really capitalizes on the scientific global health and business experience that's being brought together and is coming together from several partners. And ultimately, this is about contributing to health equity. And, you know, we talk a lot about leaving no one behind. This is about not leaving children behind, and this is about getting kids the right formulations that they can take, that their mothers can give. So let us continue, please, the spirit. Let us continue to be pushy. Let us continue to accelerate, but let us continue to account for what we are doing and for what we are achieving. Thank you, everybody.